Married and captive, the Stockholm Syndrome husband, and maybe wife? If you think you're free but still ask for permission to buy a PS5, this one's for you. Section 1, The Hook, a playful premise. Alright, let's be real for a second. Some of you listening are happily married. You're in a solid, balanced partnership. You and your spouse make decisions together, you compromise, you communicate, and everything is fair and mutual. This episode is not for you. Feel free to stick around for the laughs, but you're probably in the clear. Now some of you might be in a different situation. You might be married, but if you really sit with it, if you really think back to the guy or girl you used to be, you might realize that over the years, something has shifted. Slowly, quietly, in ways you never quite noticed. Until now. You don't make decisions without checking in first. You don't really have hobbies anymore, just obligations. You used to be spontaneous, but now everything has to be cleared, scheduled, and approved. Somewhere along the way, you went from being a man or woman with choices to a man or woman with a handler. And before you get defensive, before you say, well, isn't that just what marriage is? I have a question. When's the last time you made a major decision just for yourself without having to think about it or how it would be received? If you can't remember, welcome to today's topic, Married and Captive, the Stockholm Syndrome husband and maybe wife. And I know what you're thinking. Daniel, isn't Stockholm Syndrome what happens when someone gets kidnapped, locked in a basement, and starts to sympathize with their captor? And yeah, you're right. But let's be honest. Metaphorically speaking, is that really so different from some marriages? I'm not saying you're chained up in the basement, man, but if you were, would you even realize it at this point? That's what we're getting into today. Not to bash marriage, not to say relationships aren't worth it, but to explore a question that some of you might need to sit with. Are you a willing participant in your marriage? Or have you been slowly conditioned to accept a situation that, if you really step back and look at it, might not be as mutual as you tell yourself it is? Buckle up, because today we're asking the question, are you a Stockholm Syndrome husband or wife? And if you're already shaking your head and saying, no way, that's ridiculous, maybe you need to listen the most. Section 2. What is Stockholm Syndrome? All right. Before we start diagnosing half the married men and women in America, let's actually define what Stockholm Syndrome is. Stockholm Syndrome, at its core, is when a hostage, or someone in a controlled, powerless situation, starts identifying with, sympathizing with, and even defending their captor. It's a psychological survival mechanism. The mind says, well, I can't escape this person, so maybe if I align with them, I'll be safer. Over time, the hostage starts forming a weird kind of an emotional loyalty. Now, if you're picturing a blindfolded bank teller locked in a vault with a gun to their head, that's the extreme version. But in the real world, Stockholm Syndrome doesn't always look like a hostage in a basement. Sometimes it looks like a guy in Home Goods holding a decorative pumpkin saying, "Yeah, babe, I love fall decor." And sometimes it looks like a woman at a backyard barbecue, nervously laughing as her husband tells a joke at her expense, because she knows if she doesn't, the car ride home won't be fun. It looks like a wife saying, "Oh, no, I don't mind. He just likes things a certain way." Or staying up late finishing his laundry because he had a long day and she doesn't want to nag. And listen, am I saying every man buying scented candles with his wife is a hostage? No, some of you genuinely love a good vanilla bean scent. But let's be real. How many of you used to have an opinion? How many of you used to make decisions for yourself? And how many of you over the years just stopped? Because here's the thing. Stockholm Syndrome doesn't happen overnight. It's gradual, a slow, creeping erosion of personal agency. And it doesn't come from violence or explicit threats. It comes from guilt, obligation, the weight of expectations. It's the little thoughts that pile up over time. they'd be mad if I did that. It's just easier if I don't. A good spouse is supposed to sacrifice, right? Happy wife, happy life, right? Compromise is healthy. Submission is something else. And if you can't even see the line between the two anymore, then brother or sister, we might have a situation. So let's talk about it. Up next, the signs you might be a Stockholm Syndrome husband or wife. Section 3, signs you might be a Stockholm Syndrome husband. All right, it's time for the moment of truth. You might be thinking, okay, maybe I've lost a little bit of myself over the years, but that's just what happens in marriage, right? And sure, some level of change is normal. We all evolve in relationships. But there's evolving together, and then there's becoming a domesticated house pet. So let's do a little self-check. If you find yourself nodding to too many of these, you might just be a Stockholm Syndrome husband or a Stockholm Syndrome wife. 1. You used to have hobbies. Now you have chores. Remember when your Saturdays were for things you enjoyed? Maybe hitting the gym, playing guitar, going fishing. Now you wake up to a honey-do list that's longer than the Geneva Convention. And here's the kicker. You don't even fight it anymore. You just accept that your weekend belongs to errands. And if you do push back, you get hit with, "You'd rather go golfing than spend time with me? Must be nice to have free time. Wish I had some." And so you sigh, and off you go to Home Depot again. 2. You have to check first before doing anything. Listen, there's a difference between communicating with your partner and asking permission like a kid who wants ice cream before dinner. If you can't make a basic decision without running it by your wife, dude, that's not a partnership. That's management oversight. Examples include buying a new pair of shoes, grabbing drinks with the guys, getting a haircut that isn't pre-approved. If the thought of doing something for yourself makes you feel like you're about to be scolded, you might have a problem. 3. You defend things that make no logical sense. If someone asks, "Hey man, why do you guys only take vacations to see her family?" And your knee-jerk reaction is, "Oh, I mean, my family doesn't mind. It's just easier this way. I actually love sitting around awkwardly while they talk about people I don't know." You might want to sit with that. Stockholm Syndrome husbands don't just comply. They justify their captivity. They convince themselves that this is the way it should be. 4. Your friend suggests doing something and your first thought is, "She'd never let me." Pause, reflect, cry. If you hear yourself saying, "Nah man, she'd kill me if I did that," more than twice a week, you might not be as free as you think. Again, partnership means discussing big decisions together. But if you feel like you have to ask a warden instead of a wife every time you want to step outside your normal routine, well, might be time to break out a mirror and ask yourself some hard questions. 5. You're low-key relieved when she's out of town. This one might sting a little. If your wife goes on a girls' trip and your soul exhales like it's just been let off house arrest, that's a sign. Now, don't get me wrong, everyone enjoys a little time alone. But if you feel a sense of relief when she's gone, if you suddenly feel free to do things you normally wouldn't dare do while she's home, like eating food you like, watching movies you enjoy, playing music without judgment, existing without being scrutinized, then buddy, you've been conditioned. Now, if you've laughed at any of these, you're probably fine. A little bit of this is normal. Every relationship has its compromises. But if you're sitting there staring at the wall, realizing that every single one of these hit a little too close to home, well, might be time to ask yourself some deeper questions. Up next, the fine line, healthy partnership versus Stockholm Syndrome, because yes, there is a difference. All right, before some of you start drafting divorce papers or planning a prison break out of your marriage, let's pump the brakes. Not every guy in a committed relationship is a Stockholm Syndrome husband or Stockholm Syndrome wife. Remember, this does go both ways. There's a fine line between a healthy partnership and being a domesticated hostage. And it's important we break this down, because the last thing I want is for guys or women in good marriages to start questioning things that don't need to be questioned. So let's talk about that line. Where does normal compromise end and psychological captivity begin? 1. In a healthy marriage, there's compromise. In Stockholm Syndrome, there's submission. Healthy relationship. You and your partner both make sacrifices. She gives a little, you give a little. Sometimes you go to her favorite restaurant, sometimes she goes to yours. Stockholm marriage. You only do what she wants. Every decision caters to her preferences. Your wants? Irrelevant. The test. If you said, "That's not true, she lets me choose things all the time," but then realize that your last 5 choices were just different variations of what she already pre-approved, yeah. 2. In a healthy marriage, your voice matters. In Stockholm Syndrome, it's an echo chamber. Healthy relationship. You can say, "I don't agree with that," without feeling like you just stepped on a landmine. Stockholm marriage. If you voice a different opinion, it always leads to an argument. Over time, you just stop voicing them altogether. The test. If you've ever had the thought, "It's just easier not to bring it up," then guess what? You've been trained. 3. In a healthy marriage, you make decisions together. In Stockholm Syndrome, you wait for approval. Healthy relationship. You discuss major decisions with your partner because you respect each other. Stockholm marriage. You don't make any decisions, even small ones, without checking in first because you fear the consequences. The test. If you hesitate before buying a $20 item because you're afraid of the conversation that might follow, that's not a relationship. That's corporate governance. 4. In a healthy marriage, you feel like yourself. In Stockholm Syndrome, you're just a supporting character. Healthy relationship. You still have your own personality, interests, and sense of identity. Stockholm marriage. You don't even know what you like anymore. Your personality has slowly been replaced by whatever keeps the peace. The test. If someone asked you what your favorite meal, movie, or weekend activity is, and you instinctively base your answer on what your wife would approve of, you might need to reclaim your soul, my guy. So listen, again, relationships require compromise. That's just life. But there's a difference between being a partner and being absorbed into someone else's existence. If you've been listening to this and thinking, "Shit, this is me," don't panic. There is a way back. Up next, the quiet signs no one talks about. Because yeah, the obvious signs are easy to laugh at, but some of the biggest red flags aren't loud. They're subtle, insidious, and easy to ignore until you realize they've completely reshaped who you are. Section 5. The quiet signs no one talks about. All right, we've covered the obvious signs, the ones that make you laugh but also makes you a little uncomfortable. But here's the thing. Stockholm Syndrome in marriage doesn't always show up as blatant control. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's internal. And these are the ones people don't talk about. The ones that don't make it onto the happy wife, happy life memes. So let's talk about them. 1. You've slowly lost your sense of self, and you didn't even notice. You don't just compromise. You've forgotten what you actually want. You struggle to remember the last time you made a decision purely for yourself. Your personality has shrunk to fit the mold of what keeps things stable. The test. If someone asked, "Hey, what's something you love that has nothing to do with your wife?" and you draw a blank, that's a red flag. 2. You feel like an employee more than a partner. There's a difference between supporting your wife and working for her. You're always tasked with things, but you rarely ask what you want. But rarely asked what you want. Your relationship feels more like a hierarchy than a partnership. The test. If your daily thoughts include, what do I need to do to keep her from being upset? You might not be in a marriage. You might be in an unpaid internship. 3. You feel a deep, unexplainable resentment, but you also feel guilty about it. You can't pinpoint why you feel frustrated, but it's there. When you do think about it, you immediately shut it down with, I shouldn't feel this way. She's a good person. You never feel like you have permission to have your emotions, only to manage hers. The test. If you constantly suppress irritation with, I should be grateful, she does so much, you might be gaslighting yourself. 4. You fear rocking the boat more than you care about being honest. You don't speak your mind because it's not worth the argument. You avoid certain topics just to keep the peace. You feel like honesty isn't safe in your relationship. The test. If you've ever had a real opinion on something but changed it mid-conversation because you knew the fallout wasn't worth it, that's a problem. 5. You're tired, but you don't know why. It's not physical exhaustion, it's mental. You feel like you have to be on all the time, making sure things are okay. You don't feel like you ever get to relax fully, even at home. The test. If you feel relief when you're alone, not just I enjoy my space, but deep, unburdened relief, your nervous system might be telling you something your mind is ignoring. Now, listen, if one or two of these hit home, that's normal. But if you found yourself nodding at all of them, it might be time to ask some serious questions. Because, yeah, happy wife, happy life sounds cute, but not if it means that you stop existing in the process. Up next, what to do if you recognize yourself. Because if you just had the realization that you might be living in a metaphorical hostage situation, don't worry, there's a way back. Section 6. What to do if you recognize yourself. All right, so maybe this episode has hit a little too close to home. Maybe you started listening for the laughs, and now you're staring at the floor realizing, oh shit. And that's okay. If you're having that moment of self-awareness, you're already ahead of most people. Because here's the thing. You are not trapped. You are not powerless. And you do not have to keep living like this. But before you go flipping tables and demanding your freedom, let's talk about the right way to navigate this. Step 1. Identify what's actually happening. Take a step back and assess your situation without defensiveness. Ask yourself, am I just in a committed relationship with normal compromises? Or have I lost my autonomy without realizing it? Do I avoid certain things out of love and respect or out of fear? This isn't about blame. It's about clarity. Because before you can change anything, you have to see it clearly. Step 2. Start reclaiming small pieces of yourself. No, this doesn't mean running off to Vegas for a freedom weekend. This means reintroducing yourself to yourself. Do something just for you without asking for permission. Say no to something small and see how it feels. Make a decision, just one, without checking first. It might feel weird at first, even uncomfortable. That, my friend, is a sign of just how conditioned you've become. The test. If the idea of making a decision without consulting your wife makes you feel wrong or nervous, sit with that. Ask yourself why. Step 3. Start having honest conversations. If you're afraid to have an honest talk with your wife about your own needs, that's a big red flag. This doesn't mean starting a fight. It means communicating, hey, I've been realizing I've lost a little bit of myself, and I want to start reconnecting with the things that make me feel like me. I've noticed I always ask before making any decisions, and I don't think that's good for either of us. A healthy relationship will be open to this. A controlling one? Not so much. The test. If you know this conversation would end in anger, manipulation, or guilt tripping, that's a sign. Step 4. Pay attention to the response. If your wife is supportive and wants you to feel like yourself, great. If she gets defensive, dismisses it, or tries to make you feel guilty for even bringing it up, that's a problem. You cannot fix this alone. If your wife or husband is unwilling to acknowledge it, you have a much bigger decision to make. Step 5. Ask the hardest question. Can this be fixed? If your relationship has just slipped into bad habits, it can be fixed with communication and a shift in dynamics. If it's deeply ingrained, if she sees your compliance as the way things should be, you need to decide if you're okay with that for the rest of your life. Because here's the truth. Some people don't want partners. They want control. The test. Ask yourself, if nothing changed, if things stayed exactly like this for the next 20 years, would I be okay with that? If the answer is no, then brother, sister, it might be time to reevaluate everything. Look, I'm not saying run off and file for divorce. I'm saying if you've lost yourself, you owe it to yourself to get yourself back. And if that shakes the foundation of your marriage, maybe it's a foundation that needs to be shaken. Because at the end of the day, your life isn't just about keeping someone else happy. Your happiness matters too. Up next, the closing. A laugh and a gut punch. Let's bring this home. Section 7. The closing. A laugh and a gut punch. So here we are. We've laughed. We've reflected. Some of you have probably shifted uncomfortably in your seats more times than you'd like to admit. And maybe, just maybe, you're starting to see things a little differently. And hey, maybe you're totally fine. Maybe you're just a man or a woman in a loving relationship who willingly sacrifices a few things because that's what a partnership is. Or maybe you've just realized you haven't made a truly independent decision since Obama was in office. Either way, the important thing is this. You deserve to exist as a whole person. You deserve to have preferences. You deserve to have personal agency. You deserve to be more than just an accessory to someone else's happiness. Because at the end of the day, marriage should not feel like a lifelong corporate job where the CEO is your wife or husband and you're the underpaid intern. It should feel like a team. So if this episode has given you even a tiny wake-up call, don't just shrug it off. Do something with it. Start small. Pay attention. Have the conversations. And for the love of God, if your first instinct is to ask your wife or husband if you're allowed to apply any of this, bro, we need to fucking talk. Look, again, if you laughed at this episode, you're probably good. But if you laughed and then sat in silence, well, I think you know what that means. All right, that's it for today's episode. If you enjoyed this and want more brutally honest, slightly uncomfortable, but definitely thought-provoking conversations, make sure to follow the podcast. And if this episode made you question your entire marriage, my bad. Or maybe you're welcome. Either way, I'll catch you in the next one.